Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good evening to our viewers. Welcome to Urgent Spotlight. My name is Azrul Muhammad Khalib. This is a series of online talk shows where we will be covering how the various policies implemented during the COVID-19 period, such as the Movement Control Order, have impacted today's urgent issues related to women, workers' welfare, the urban poor, refugees, education, Indigenous people, migrants, and of course, healthcare. The agenda for Urgent Spotlight is policy reform and holding the government accountable. The show is broadcast live via the CSO Platform for Reform's Facebook page. To describe the first 2 quarters of the year for Malaysian politics as momentous would be a profound understatement. The ruling government changed from Pakatan Harapan to what is now known as Perikatan Nasional through a process which seems to have excluded parliamentary processes, and some would say even excluded democratic norms. There was no vote of no confidence table. There was no clear accountable measure for which the rakyat who voted for the members of parliament to know how their representatives represented their voices and concerns. The turmoil ended with the swearing-in of the winners in early March. This was Game of Thrones, the Malaysian edition. Parliament, which was originally scheduled to meet on the 9th March, was postponed due to the change of government and was supposed to meet later that month, but then we had and still have the COVID-19 crisis, which caused further postponement as the powers that be grappled with the outbreak of the coronavirus. After 2 months of a lockdown which has crippled the economy and shattered numerous lower and middle income households across the country, Parliament is finally having its first meeting next Monday on 18th May, but it's meeting only for 1 day. Does it matter? What difference does it make for Makcik Kia or Madam Lee or Haji Saleh and Surjit Kaur if Parliament meets longer? Are these political games which have no benefit whatsoever for the rakyat? To help answer these questions and some of the many thorny issues about what's happening, we have with us this evening political analyst Ms. Tricia Yeoh. She is a former Chief Operating Officer and now Fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS. Tricia is on PhD study leave at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, researching federal-state relations in Malaysia, and she is the author of States of Reform Governing Selangor and Penang, editor of The Road to Reform, Pakatan Rakyat and Selangor, and director of the award-winning documentary The Rights of the Dead, about the mysterious death of Teo Beng Hawk in 2009. Tricia was also research officer to the former Selangor Chief Minister. Welcome to the show, Tricia.
Hi, Azrul, and thanks for having me tonight.
Well, just for us to start, for our viewers out there, please don't hesitate to send your questions to the FB Live comment section, and we will try to get them answered here. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, Tricia, for what is going to be an exciting non-event. So let's go straight into it, shall we? My first question to you: why should the rakyat even care about this coming 18th May parliamentary session? What's different about it compared to every other session before this? And the next session is actually scheduled for mid-July, which is just 2 months away. So why should the people be concerned?
Thanks, Azrul, for raising that. I think it's good that you're trying to link this back to the rakyat and why should the people care. I mean, many things that have taken place in the last few months have been very much about internal political maneuverings, which the people have not had much access to, much less, decision-making processes or impact on. So the question of why should we care? Essentially, I think the question needs to be broadened out again as to what is the role of Parliament and why should people care about Parliament at all in the first place. Parliament is, one of the 3 very important pillars in government that makes decisions for people's lives. And Parliament has its 222 members of Parliament representing all the people. And I suppose the most important thing that they do, or the role that MPs are supposed to do, is to table motions, to table bills, to discuss matters of urgent interest, of national interest. And this is why people should care about Parliament in general. So why people should care about this coming parliamentary sitting on Monday, for several reasons. One, I already described that Parliament's role is to discuss matters of urgency. And we know that this is the first parliamentary sitting since the change of government. Many things have transpired. The Perikatan National Government has not yet had the chance to, in a way, demonstrate what its policy making intentions are. What is the kind of outlook that they want for the country. So that's one. Number two, we all know that we have been embroiled in this COVID-19 crisis, and something like that has to be discussed. The government has rolled out certain plans, and the biggest of which is the economic stimulus package of 250 billion ringgit. Actually, the fiscal injection is only about 30 billion ringgit. But the point is that, have the MPs had the opportunity to discuss whether this is the right way that the money should be disbursed, the implementation of it, what's the results? And thirdly, where is the future of the economy? I mean, how will Malaysia look like following the COVID-19 crisis? I mean, there are matters of urgent discussion that need to be put on the table for our representatives to talk about. And we also want to keep our representatives accountable. So that's why it's really important. And, having it for one day, I think we're going more into that, is grossly insufficient for us to be able to debate all of these matters of urgent importance.
Well, Tricia, you mentioned quite a lot of factors there, which we will further expand upon throughout the course of this show. And certainly one of the things that we wanted to basically hear with regards to the argument of having a much more a longer extended session is accountability of the actions of government to the rakyat. And the thing is that the rakyat are very much fed up, frustrated, and arguably fatigued by what could be described as political shenanigans by the different parties involved. And in fact, this extension of or a much more a longer period for the parliamentary session, we have heard nothing other than what has been highlighted as a motion of no confidence towards the existing leadership, as opposed to any of the issues that you just raised. So we haven't heard any of those concerns being raised by the different parliamentarians. Instead, we've just been hearing about who's in charge yet again. So one of the things that Rakyat are concerned about is this: if we have it a much more longer session, are we just going to have a Groundhog Day where we're going to have this thing all over again, and it's going to be yet another time-consuming process where none of the important questions which you just raised are going to be brought up, but instead we're going to have yet again trying to decide who is going to be left standing when the music stops?
Well, I think.
Tell me, how do you reassure the Rakyat there?
Well, I definitely don't represent any political side, so I agree with you there that not enough is being said, even from amongst our opposition MPs, about the importance of tabling, the bills that will be needed to pass the economic stimulus package. But having said that, I think the former Law Minister VK Liew was the only one who tabled a motion, which, by the way, was accepted, so that the Parliament would be extended from a one-day sitting to an 8-day sitting. I don't think any of them actually tabled the motion, or maybe if they did, it was either rejected or not reported. None of them actually tabled the motion to discuss the economic stimulus package. But again, I believe that is because, and another news article said that originally the Perikatan National Government was already planning to table 4 motions and 2 bills. The 4 motions, one of which included, I think, appointing a new Public Accounts Committee chairperson, and the 2 bills were actually the bills, supplementary supply bills, to essentially pass enough funds for the government to spend for the stimulus package. So perhaps that was already on the table. And of course, the most recent information that we got from the speaker was that, suddenly this has been reduced even further. So I think while there was already dissatisfaction that it was just a one-day meeting, with the 4 motions and the 2 bills, the action of the Prime Minister in requesting that it is reduced even further by only allowing the King's Speech and not even a debate of the King's Speech, which I understand is the Convention of Parliament, that has raised further questions and, of course, further ire. And I do hope that we will hear more from our MPs about the important things that need to be discussed. So you're right. It's definitely not just about who is in power, although that's also important because we do need to table the motion in Parliament as to who is the official opposition leader. That has not happened. But greater concerns about COVID, many things have been happening around COVID, not just about stimulus package, right? We've got concerns over migrant workers, we've got concerns about arrests, and I think the biggest thing is, what is the economic outlook like in a time where the country has, the highest unemployment rate for a long time yet.
So obviously the government knows all of that. They recognize that. You can tell from the different discussions that are happening between different ministers, the daily briefings that are being given, and of course the kind of stimulus packages that have been rolled out by the government. So having recognized all that, why do you think that the government has actually made a determination that only one day is sufficient? Or is it not the government that determined it? It was the Speaker who determined that there would be only one day, and that there are no other items on the agenda aside from the royal address by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. There's not even a debate about the address of the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. So why do you think that the government or the Speaker has decided that one day is enough?
So I think many analysts have come to that conclusion for me, or for us. And that conclusion, or the most common view, is that the Constitution actually says that the House of Parliament cannot, the House of Parliament needs to sit. Okay, let me rephrase that. There cannot be 6 months of no sitting of Parliament, right? So we know that the last date of parliamentary sitting was the 5th of December 2019. And so 6 months after that would be sometime in June. And if you do not sit within that 6-month period, then Parliament is essentially breaching the Constitution. And then that would come into question the legitimacy of government and so on. So have a meeting, one day or not at all. That is what the Perikatan Nasional believes to be sufficient to fulfill that condition of the Constitution. But having said that, there are concerns, as to the constitutionality of this sitting. I think that there are already some legal analysts. In fact, 2 people have brought this as a case in court to determine whether this will even be considered a sitting at all. They refer to the standing orders, and this is all very technical, but I'll just keep it short to say that they believe that the standing orders requires there to have continuity. The sitting needs to be continuous, and if you're just sitting for 1 hour, however long it takes for the Agong to give his speech, that does not, represent continuity at all. And I think more importantly, as I said, at the very beginning, it is the first parliamentary session of the new government, and the concern, I suppose, from the current Prime Minister is that if there was any motion, any bill that is tabled in Parliament that does not receive the support of a simple majority of Parliament, that could put into question the legitimacy of the Prime Minister's leadership and of the government's leadership. So I think that's a pretty commonly held view. The alternative view is that, go ahead.
So basically, we're looking at this really being a constitutional requirement that they need to tick the box and say we've had the meeting that satisfies the requirement under the Constitution for the 6-month period, and therefore we adjourn, because it obviously does not end the session, it adjourns to a later date, which can then be held arguably now in July. So basically, the government has basically said that we want to focus on dealing with COVID-19. We don't want to go into the parliamentary debates because it may not necessarily be safe. So we want to just be able to say that we started the parliamentary session for year 2020 and then we're moving on. So let me ask you this. Obviously Malaysia is not the only country with a parliamentary democracy. But when you look at it in this time of the COVID-19 crisis, there's public health concerns, especially needing to maintain distancing between individuals, high levels of hygiene, and working to break the chain of transmission. Isn't that all more important than meeting to discuss and debate issues in Parliament? Aren't other countries also doing what Malaysia is doing, which is to either keep the meeting short or perhaps not even meet at all? What other countries can you cite that are actually maintaining their normal parliamentary calendars, that it's business as usual despite the COVID crisis?
Yeah, so we know that the government's justification has been COVID-19, the need to have social distancing, and so that's why only a half a day sitting, and also let's not forget they've also restricted the media, right? So only 2 official media is permitted, will be permitted to enter Parliament on that day. The justification that they have given does not hold water. We know that because other parliamentary systems around the world, and like you said, all of these countries are going through the same problems of COVID-19. Nobody wants to meet en masse. No mass gatherings are allowed. But we do know that a country that's very close to home, Singapore, they have passed an amendment in their constitution that will allow members of parliament to meet in several places, because their current constitution, or prior to the amendment, required that all MPs needed to meet in one physical location. So our constitution doesn't even require that. And they have done so to ensure that when Parliament resumes, they can have it maybe in multiple places. The UK, I mean, the British Parliament, which is where our constitution has a lot of similarities, and our entire parliamentary system is derived on, and so on. They have met as well, and they did that by having a temporary amendment to their Commons standing orders, which I think they're going to renew because COVID has not resolved, and so on. And so what they did was quite clever. They just had 50 MPs in the House of Parliament, and 120 others met remotely with Zoom links. And we know that we have available today all these technological facilities. These are just 2 examples, and there are others. I mean, even South Africa, I think, has done so online. The EU Parliament has met as well, keeping to their dates. So there's no real reason that our Parliament cannot do the same. We have the technology available. I have heard one argument from a government representative that in the rural areas, maybe they don't have good connection. But I don't think that's justifiable either, because they can always fly MPs in the rural areas into cities that are the closest to them and make connections available there. So if the government really wanted to do it, I think then it should well be able to do it. And the House of Parliament is the best place for them to be able to vote such a motion into passing.
But don't you think that, we have standing committees which are comprised of bipartisan, that you have both opposition and a government being part of, and they could have easily done what you just described, as in recommending a modification to the standing orders to allow for Parliament to nevertheless be able to communicate through teleconferencing, video conferencing, through Zoom or through Skype or whatever platform that they decide on. Yet, my understanding is that they have not yet met at all to discuss this issue, much less decide on a modification to the standing order, which allows for the Speaker to then act on. So until they meet, the Speaker is just bound to the existing standing orders, which arguably may not allow for what is being proposed as in a remote or virtual Parliament. So how can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been some issues raised with regards to this Standing Orders Committee. I think, I know that a statement was issued just today by a Member of Parliament, YB Khairi, saying that the Standing Orders Committee has not yet met. But from my understanding of it, the committee members are not the ones who have the local standby to call for the meeting to take place. The Speaker, who is the chair of the Standing Orders Committee, he is the one who calls for such a meeting to take place. And ultimately, the House is the one that would direct the Standing Orders Committee to make amendments as they so require. And this is contained within the standing orders. But the point of all this is that the sum short conclusion of all this is that ultimately the House is still the best and the most appropriate place to table any motion, and a motion could be tabled at the very beginning of the sitting, or, I mean, just after the Agong speech, perhaps, to perhaps, make those requirements, or directing the committee to meet to make those amendments, and the House can pass that. So that would be the fastest way to do it. And here we also have to talk about the efficiency and the timing of things, because if you go to the Standing Orders Committee, it might take 2-3 meetings. They have to go back to the House for debate and so on. The point is that if the government really wanted to do something like remote
It could do
parliament,
it.
it could do it. I mean, there are many ways to do it, and the speaker is powerful, right? So the speaker can direct whatever committee, make those amendments. The government can do it. The prime minister is powerful. So I really do think that we need to keep the accountability on the leaders who have the powers to do so.
So, one of the things that's been pointed out was that the one-day session was not decided by the speaker, but was actually decided by the leader of the House, which was, in this case, the Prime Minister. So there is something of a debate that's going on there in terms of where are we in terms of the traditional roles of the speaker within the Westminster system as what we practice here in Malaysia. But let me ask you this. A national emergency was not declared. The actions of the government are still accountable to the representatives of the people in Parliament. Nothing has happened that relinquishes them of that responsibility, and Parliament is the guardian of our democracy. It is not a rubber stamp institution. So you just highlighted just now in terms of the billions in expenditure, which was not approved in the previous budget debates for stimulus packages, which was announced by the government during the movement control order. Do they actually, or should they require the assent of MPs in the Dewan? Do you think there is a check and balance in what is occurring today, or is there totally no oversight?
I like this question a lot because, I like the fact that people are suddenly interested in Parliament, because I think the assumption of many people is that we have a functioning Parliament. Yes, the Parliament sits for X number of days a year, but in short, we do not have a robust institution of Parliament. It is no way robust enough to perform the functions and roles that are constitutionally required of it. And why do I say that? While the previous Pakatan Harapan government had put in place some standing committees and select committees to improve the parliamentary processes, I'll give you a simple fact. So you said that the stimulus package has been spent before any approval has been made. And so that puts to question the legality of it, correct?
Indeed.
Do you know that year after year, we also have supplementary budgets that are passed after the fact? So it's a little known fact that, so at the end of the year, there's a budget that is tabled for the following year, and everyone goes to town about analyzing it, how much is being given to the youth, the civil servants, the unemployed, and so on. But what fewer people do is to actually scrutinize the supplementary budget that's usually tabled in the middle of the following year, usually or typically to replace the amount that had already been spent. So in terms of your accountability checks and balances, I mean, this is actually a norm that our Parliament has unfortunately bowed to. And there are many other things that I could talk about Parliament, but I think in short, we need to recognize that parliamentary systems and institutions need to be improved, even for our MPs to play the role that we vote them in to do. So if you were an MP today, you would be very frustrated because all you would do is go into Parliament, the executive arm of government, which is basically your ministries, or in the case of the budget, it will be the Ministry of Finance. So they'll table this, fancy looking budget every year. And what role can you really play? I mean, even if you criticize it, if you disagree with some of the allocations that are being spent, there's very little that you can do. And in the history of Malaysian budget tabling, and I think it will be the same thing for the supplementary bill that will be discussed perhaps in the next sitting for the stimulus package. None of the MPs will be able to change a single line item, even if you were an MP. So this is why standing committees, select committees are so important. So bills need to be scrutinized even before they go into Parliament.
So, we have the COVID-19 crisis that's ongoing. How long do you think that the government is able to postpone the resumption of a normal parliamentary schedule? What is even the new normal for Parliament now? The COVID-19 public health crisis is something that we have been told to expect that we have to live with for at least maybe up to 2 years. So the previous pandemics such as SARS and H1N1 did not result in Parliament not being able to meet. So the current situation that we're in right now, we've never seen before. It's unprecedented. The next meeting after this one ends on Monday is 13 July to 27 August, and that's almost a month for discussions and debate to encompass a half year's worth of developments. Is that sufficient time?
Well, it's not the short answer, and that's because Parliament already doesn't sit enough days in a year. But of course, 1 month would be more than what we're having in the coming Mondays. So there is hope that there will be time to discuss the many things that would have been put on hold by then. So there's also the third sitting that will come in, say, September. I think it's September, the third parliamentary sitting of the year. So in a sense, the government cannot run, so to speak, away from a lengthy parliamentary sitting. It will need to, at some point, allow MPs to discuss, to debate, to table motions, to table bills, and that would be the test of the government's strength, which I think is the point of contention at the moment, where the opposition MPs are saying that the government is afraid to hold this parliamentary sitting. Whatever it is, yes, COVID or not, there will have to come a time where Parliament does sit, especially when it comes to the budget. So the budget sitting will be important, and a vote will have to be made. So you like it or not, because you're talking about a very important piece of legislation that will determine how much is going to be to fund the country in the coming year.
Arguably, there's a lot of bills that you've mentioned that are on the burner that needs to actually pass. So there will be a legislative agenda that require a number of votes, whether in the July session or the one after that. So let me ask you, today we heard that all of the MPs were tested for COVID-19 and the results came in, all of them are negative. So what's stopping them actually from just having a much more longer session, since none of them are infected with COVID-19? So I'm asking a question from a viewer here, which is, since they are now basically part-timers in terms of being parliamentarians, they're no longer considered full-time parliamentarians. And perhaps we should, and this is just my addition to this, perhaps we should slash their pay in the way that many people are experiencing right now with the kind of work that's expected. Surely we're not getting our money's worth from people who are basically just coming into work a few times a year.
Yeah, I suppose that's correct, but this is the question that would need to be put to the Parliament and to government itself, right? Not to us, but I mean that's certainly a proposal that
I don't know, Tricia. We all pay tax. These guys are getting paid out of the taxpayers' money, and certainly they are accountable to the Rakyat. The Rakyat are not very happy to see that these guys are coming in already not working as hard as other parliamentarians in other countries. Even Singapore parliamentarians work a lot more. Arguably this year, they are still in session. They're still debating and voting on bills. So I think when you look at performance for MPs, perhaps they're not as much compared to other country parliamentarians.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. And I think this also goes into educating the public as to what the role of the MPs ultimately are for. Your MP's role, while it's good that they are taking care of their constituents and perhaps giving them aid packages and so on. But that role can also be similarly performed by a community leader or a local councillor. Ultimately, the MP's role is to be able to pass bills in Parliament that will have an effect on the rest of the country. So whoever asked that question, I think that's something that we should definitely raise and say that the MPs are cutting their time in Parliament by half or less than half. So similarly should be their salaries. But on the point of expense, I think it's also important to point out that um, the government is paying for all of our MPs to have come to KL over the last few days, and they'll be staying for 5 nights, paying for their travel expenses, and then only coming in for what essentially could have been. I mean, if it's just going to be the Agong speech, then why could it not have also been televised live, like many speeches that we have been listening to now from the Prime Minister? So again, I think it does put a question, and it does make a mockery of the Monday sitting.
Well, it goes back to how people look at grassroots consultations and the processes that involve the representatives of the constituents, meaning the members of parliament, being treated. In this case, we have a situation where, as you just said, that perhaps expenditure is done and bills are passed after the fact. And this is something that we've seen time and again, where bills are given maybe 48 hours or even 24 hours for reading before it then gets passed somehow in the middle of the night, and hardly has any kind of input from people whose lives are affected. So I have a question here, which is that basically means today the processes involve a situation where we only know about what's being tabled when it's already too late to do anything about it. So we have fundamental problems with the parliamentary process itself. Obviously, our system is based on the Westminster system, and surely they don't do what we do in the UK. So how do we ensure that our MPs really represent our views when it comes to the debating of these bills, and in fact, the way that the government is actually putting together these bills to begin with? What can we do better?
Yeah, so if you look at there's a lot of resources available if you're interested in that kind of thing. Malaysia is obviously part of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth Parliament website has a whole lot of resources available. If you just go to the Australian House website, there are 3 different. So there's a Senate. There's a whole list of the Senate committees. There's a list of the House committees. And those committees are far and wide-ranging. It's on finance and public administration, expenditure, tax. It's technical, right? So the point is that these select committees or standing committees. So let me just differentiate between the two. So standing committees are committees that are supposed to regularly look through matters of interest, and they usually shadow a certain ministry, so they are permanent. Select committees are put in when there's something urgent to discuss. So if it was on COVID, then there could be a COVID select committee, whereas if it's a permanent fiscal standing committee, and this is actually what the PH government had put. They introduced some new standing committees, and the one of course I'm interested in is the federal state standing committee. So the process should be that a certain bill, before it gets into Parliament, will go through the process of the standing or the select committee. It's a bipartisan committee as well. They go through the contents of the bill, and perhaps then it goes into Parliament for the first reading, and then following that it goes back to the committee, and they can call outside representation as well. I can actually give you an example. So what happened in the Selangor Legislative Assembly when it first passed the Freedom of Information enactment at state level? So it was the first state government to ever do that, and they followed that process quite strictly. They had a first reading in the State Assembly, they had a committee, and they called civil society into the hall itself of the State Assembly. had the criticisms, disagreed with the government, and there was a lot of fire exchange. But that's the whole point of this system. And this is where representatives, not from within government, can also have their voices heard. That was done, second reading, and I think even more discussion and debate on both sides of the divide. Yeah, so this included members of the opposition, legislative assembly persons as well, and then finally the enactment was passed in Selangor. Penang also passed the enactment. I'm not sure if they went through as stringent and rigorous a process, but the point is that there are SOPs that can be followed. There are many references around the world, and I just do hope that the current PN government also keeps those standing committees, because that would have been a really good start to improve the strength of the institution of parliament.
Well, you mentioned a few times in this discussion right now, parliamentary select committees, or PSCs, which were formed by the previous administration. And we have, as you said, PSCs for budget, defense and home affairs, gender equality and family development. And there was even one for health, education, community and social development, but they really never met. So what is the likely fate of these PSCs in the wake of this one-day parliamentary session? Are they able to meet separately through video conference, such as how it's done in the UK? Will they actually still continue to exist at all? Your comments?
We have heard nothing about these committees, so I remain quite doubtful as to whether the committees will continue. We hope that they will, but I think I have also raised in one of my previous articles that even for this stimulus package or discussion of the COVID, a select committee should have already been formed by now. A select committee that includes obviously members of the opposition, so it's bipartisan, and they could have gone through that rigorous process of discussing something before it goes into parliament. But I mean, I think, Azrul, like, all these questions are really, they're quite moot points at this moment, because here we are talking about this very high level standards of accountability, of checks and balances, and really we don't see equally the sort of serious intentions from government in wanting to do more than have the perfunctory sitting, as long as it fulfills that constitutional requirement, which again some have disputed.
I mean, you're alleging a very serious gap here, which is that we basically do not have checks and balances with regards to this current administration, and that is something that we need to be able to address, because without Parliament meeting and to have these rigorous debates, then we will have a situation where the government may be able to do whatever it wants. So what for parliamentary reform, knowing that we've gone through a phase of parliamentary reform in the previous government, and now that we have this one, what's your top priority for the agenda for Malaysia when it comes to this area?
For parliamentary reform, I think number one, they should maintain the standing committees, not just maintain, but add on more standing committees, more select committees to discuss urgent matters like COVID and economic fallout. So that needs to continue. And as you rightly pointed out, all of these meetings can and should be done online. The committees are much smaller numbers of members. They could do, half of them sitting in a room somewhere, half of them online. So the committee system should continue. The second thing is that I think more resources need to be given to parliamentary researchers. So the last I know about there are very few parliamentary researchers, less than 20. And these researchers are meant to improve the quality of debate amongst MPs. I know that all MPs now have their own, researchers, but they pay them out of pocket. So the parliamentary researchers are supposed to be able to be applicable for all 222 alike, but obviously with the small number of them, they cannot serve that purpose. Resources include, having more research-based debate, so boosting up things like the library, boosting up the electronic access to the library and to documents and resources, And I mean, also, I think the National Archives could also come into play here. The archives could collaborate with the parliamentary library. I mean, I've been to the archives. They have a system, but it could be improved. So a much more research, rigorous, data-based approach to doing parliament, I think, would help in building up the institution much better than they have today. And of course, the other fourth point, or I'm not sure, third or fourth that I mentioned now, is to increase the number of days of sitting in parliament, increase the number of days, and finally to send the bills in much earlier, so that the MPs and members of the public, and people like you and I who are not MPs, will have access to them, make them publicly available, televise everything online, and make it open and transparent. I mean, I know we're about to end now, but the point is that if Parliament is supposed to be representation of the people, then there has to be this transparent, accountable process, and do much more than it is doing today.
You mentioned that the parliamentary select committees should be able to meet. And now that we technically have already buka kedai with this Monday session, can the PSCs meet independently after 18th May? So they don't have to be dependent on an actual session of the Dewan Rakyat.
They don't have to depend on the session, but the Parliamentary Select Committee would probably get its mandate to meet officially via the Parliament itself. So Parliament has a system, a set of, I mean, we all saw, for instance, the letters that came from the Secretary of Parliament, right? So that's the Parliamentary Secretary. So I believe that no meeting can ensue unless the official secretary or representative of Parliament itself issues that directive, and that would usually come from, I believe, the Speaker. So technically, again, they can meet, but it really depends on the parliamentary processes itself.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of the show this evening, Tricia, and one of the things that we're all going to be looking at is what is the outcome or the post-18th May discussions that will occur. Certainly, there will be a lot of debate online and in the media. But what do you think should happen if the government were to be, or the Speaker, whoever it is that determines how the Parliament calendar should look like? What do you think should happen if the government were to consider a change in what it has already decided? What would you like to see happen post 18 May?
Well, I believe that the Speaker actually has the legal and constitutional mandate to decide what can and cannot be ultimately discussed and debated within the Dewan Rakyat. I think the Constitution is quite clear. The standing orders are definitely very clear that the Speaker has that right to determine what's going to happen on 18 May. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I think the reading of it is quite clear. So I think there is hope that the Speaker will do the right thing come 18 May. But if failing which that does not happen, what is going to happen in July then would be very important for the rest of us to be aware of. The government will need to have some sort of vote in Parliament, and that is the vote that we would be interested in. It has not yet been tested in Malaysia, but any vote in Parliament would be construed as a level of support for the current government, which, as we all know, changed on the 1st of March. And that
so basically, we're looking at every bill being a referendum on the government, basically.
I think it has come to that, unfortunately. I think it has come to that. Yeah.
Well, that's all the time that we have for this show this evening. Thank you, Tricia, for being such an excellent guest for this evening's discussion. Thank you for spending your time with us.
Thank you, Azrul, and thanks CSO Platform for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, that ends this evening's segment discussing the upcoming parliamentary session. Please tune in to the Bahasa broadcast at the same time tomorrow night, where we continue this invigorating conversation. This is Azrul Khalib signing off. Good night.